Oh, good morning. Pretty close to it anyway. Or good afternoon, good evening, or good night, whatever time it is you're watching this. I wanted a little bit of a change of scenery, so I'm on the back porch, listen to the birds, the wind, going through the trees and everything like that. And I thought this would be the perfect setting to discuss the second to last topic, which is the human reproductive system. We spent a lot of time talking about other systems, and what's interesting about this system is that it's the only system that's not essential to the life of the individual. If something were to happen to your reproductive system, that wouldn't necessarily be fatal, which I think is kind of interesting. It however, has huge effects on other systems, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So there's male and female reproductive organs that are, in some cases, very, very different. However, they do share some general similarities. For example, both sets of organs produce and store specialized reproductive cells, and when you combine those cells, male cells and female cells, they create new individuals. They also secrete hormones that play major functions in maintaining normal sexual function, development of secondary sexual characteristics, and stuff like that. General structures of the reproductive systems include gonads that produce gametes, which are reproductive cells, and hormones, the ducts that receive and transport gametes, accessory glands that secrete fluids that are important for gametes to move through different systems, and the perineal structures that are collectively known as external genitalia, so the outside of the body cavity. We're going to, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're also talking about the reproductive tract. That's the passages that link the inside to the outside, that can get male gametes out, allow them access in to meet the female gametes, allowing the embryo to get out also. The different reproductive systems are functionally different as well as structurally different. For example, females produce one gamete per month, and their organs are responsible for retaining and nurturing the zygote. That's a kind of a dry term for what the baby's going to turn out to be. Males produce large quantities of gametes, and up to 500 million per day. And the timeline of when those are produced and how often is also drastically different. So we're going to do this in episodes, I guess you can think about it, where we're going to talk about male reproductive system and female reproductive system separately, and then we'll have a third video talking about function, hormone regulation. We're going to look into that in a little bit more detail. The effects of aging, what happens to your reproductive system as you get older, so on and so forth. There's not a particular order that you need to watch these. Just make sure that you watch all three of them by the time you are done. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about our first reproductive system. Okay, I see I was unsuccessful in scaring you away with that intro. We'll see if I can do better. All right. So we are talking about the reproductive system still. This time, in this particular video segment, we're going to talk about the female reproductive system. I'm going to forewarn you now. Ladies, you probably are already aware of this. Gentlemen, this is good to know. This is going to be a lot more complicated than the video about the male reproductive system. There's a whole lot more stuff going on, just in general. So this one's going to take a little bit longer. Just letting you know right now. Okay, so starting with the female reproductive system, we have a number of different structures. We're going to start with the gametes, or I'm sorry, we're going to start with the gonads. Remember, the gonads are responsible for the production of the gametes and hormones that are driving a lot of these processes and organ development and stuff like that. In females, in women, the gamete, the gonad, is the ovary right here. If you recall, those are the ones that I dropped and sent skittering across my floor. Okay, these release one immature gamete. In women, it's known as an oocyte, and it's also responsible for producing hormones. We also have, as part of the actual tract, we have the uterine tubes, which are is this tube right here that connects the ovary to the uterus. It carries the oocyte as it's released from the ovary, where it's deposited to the uterus. That's also where fertilization takes place, when sperm meets egg and turns into what's called an ovum. Which is a fully diploid egg. That's a single cell. Eventually that's going to turn into a baby. We have the uterus that I've mentioned a couple of times. Is this structure right here that is responsible for enclosing and supporting the developing embryo, if an embryo is in place. And then from there we have a channel that is the vagina that connects the uterus to the outside structures. We have a number of tissues that hold everything together. There we go. That's the one I want. Okay. So the ovaries, the uterine tubes, and the uterus are all enclosed in something called the broad ligament, which is this thing right here. Kind of looks like wings, I don't know. And the uterine tubes run along the anterior portion of this broad ligament, sort of setting up the uppermost boundary, I guess. And then everything else is attached inferior to that. These will open the pelvic cavity, I apologize, into the pelvic cavity lateral to the ovaries. So they're actually going to open up and attach here on the outside and then connect in and sort of loop around. The ovaries themselves are small, almond-shaped structures near the lateral wall of the pelvic cavity. They have got three main functions. One, like I said, is to produce and release immature gametes, the oocytes, the secretion of female sex hormones. If you've watched the male anatomy video, you know that the primary one is testosterone. In females, it's two, actually: estrogen, or at least there's a class of hormones called estrogens, and progesterone. And the secretion of another hormone that we also mentioned in the male anatomy video called inhibin, which, again, just like in males, that's involved in the feedback mechanism of follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and the estrogens, which we'll get into later. Similar in that it's a negative feedback loop, very different because the structures are different, and the types of cells that we're dealing with is very different. Moving from the ovaries out is the uterine tubes, are also known as the fallopian tubes. That, depending on where you're coming from, that could be the more common term that you're used to hearing, or the oviducts. All three of those are acceptable. They're hollow tubes about 13 centimeters long that are responsible for transporting the oocytes, and they come in three segments. The first part is the beginning, or the opening, which is known as the infundibulum, which is right here. The actual attachment point of the fallopian tubes to the ovary is known as the fimbriae. That's this sort of feathered looking thing right there. Just past that is the infundibulum. As you curve around this curved part right here, is the ampulla, and it's the walls of the actual tissue of the tubes themselves are going to start to get thicker as you get closer to the uterus. And then the isthmus, which is this long part right here, is that final part of the fallopian tube that's going to connect the ampulla to the actual uterus and open up into the uterus. The actual process of fertilization is going to take place in the fallopian tube, in the uterine tube. The secondary oocyte, and I'm going to explain what that means in a little bit, but that oocyte, that immature egg cell that I mentioned earlier, has to meet in here within the first 12 to 24 hours of being released from the egg in order for fertilization to take place. Fertilization is going to happen at the boundary between the ampulla and the isthmus. So if you remember, we had ovaries here and here. We had the ampulla is this part right here going into the isthmus, and then we had, that's terrible, I'm not an artist, I apologize. So the actual fertilization is going to take place basically like here-ish. As part of that process, we have cells called PEG cells within the epithelium of the fallopian tube tissue that's going to secrete fluid. And that fluid is the kind of complete the capacitation of the sperm. Now, if you don't know what that means, you need to go back and look at the male anatomy video. If you've already watched that one, you know that this is the second step where the sperm is made able to fertilize. And it also supplies nutrients to the sperm and the pre-embryo, that secondary oocyte, in order for fertilization to take place. We have, moving into that now, interior, medially, let's say, we have the uterus that provides the home, basically, for the embryo. Now, we've got different terminologies for what the baby is called based on different stages. It's considered an embryo for the first 8 weeks. And then after that, we stop referring to it as an embryo, and we start referring to the baby as a fetus. And then from there, it's a fetus until the baby is born. It provides mechanical protection, nutritional support, and waste removal. And we're going to talk a lot about that when we get into the development section middle of next week. It's a roughly pear-shaped organ. It normally bends anteriorly to near the base, so it's going to bend forward, basically, is what that means. If the uterus is in retroflexion, that means it's bending the other way. It's bending posteriorly, and that could cause some problems for the birthing process and stuff like that. There's a number of ligaments that hold the uterus in place. It's not just free floating. We want to make sure all of that stuff stays locked in position. So we have the 3 ligaments, the uteral sacral ligament. Let me get my pen. It's thinking, I apologize. Okay, so the uteral sacral ligament is going to prevent the uterus from moving forward, backwards. Okay, anterior, inferior. The round ligaments, which are back here in the back, are going to keep are going to restrict movement of the posterior of the uterus, so kind of the back sort of swinging back and forth. And then the cardinal ligaments, which are in here, a sort of feathery looking part, is going to prevent inferior movement, so to prevent it from moving downwards, basically. We have the body of the uterus itself. Is the largest portion. Too far. Okay, so the body is the largest portion, this part right here. It ends at the isthmus, which is a constriction point down over here in this area. And then that leads to the cervix, which is this part, this structure right here. But that's the most inferior portion of the uterus. It's basically the opening that separates the uterus from the vaginal canal. The actual opening itself is known as the external os, which leads into the cervical canal. And the cervical canal itself, which is in here, is a passageway that between the uterine cavity and what's known as the internal os, which is another structure similar to the external one. And I thought I had a picture. Okay, I don't, so I apologize. Looking at the actual tissue of the uterus itself, we can divide it up into 3 layers. The perimetrium is the outermost layer right here, this gray part that wraps all the way around, and it covers the outside of the uterus. The thickest layer is the myometrium, so that goes from here to here, and it's very thick. There's a lot of musculature there. It also constitutes almost 90% of the entire mass of the uterus. It's smooth muscle arranged in 3 different ways: longitudinal, circular, and oblique. And it provides the pushing force for the moving the baby. So if you've ever been involved in childbirth in any capacity, the pushing happens with these muscles in the uterus. Moving all the way inwards, we have the endometrium, which is this sort of bluish, grayish tissue. That's the remaining 10% or so. It's got glandular tissue and vascular tissue that are responsible for the supporting the uterus, providing for the physiological demands, providing food, eliminating waste, stuff like that. Many of the glands that are in the uterus will open directly into the actual cavity of the uterus, and will extend deeply into some of the inner parts of that endometrium right there. And this layer is the most active as far as changes, and fluctuating levels of estrogens and progesterone is going to change the structure of this layer, increase or decrease vascularization, the glandular production, stuff like that. Within the endometrium, we can further subdivide it into 2 layers. The functional layer, which contains most of the uterine glands, so we're talking right here, okay, where all the vascular tissue is and stuff like that. That's the majority of the thickness of the uterine wall. That's where all the activity is going to be happening that has to do with the uterus and the monthly cycles and stuff like that. And then there's the basal layer, which is right here, and that's going to basically attach the endometrium to the myometrium. And there's not really a whole lot of stuff that goes on right there. Changes, I mentioned those in the actual endometrium. Now, the other layers don't change that much. The myometrium and the perimetrium, their structure does not change really that much at all, especially not to the degree that we see with the endometrium. The functional layer primarily goes through changes that correspond with cyclical changes in hormone levels, which lead to changes in tissue and stuff like that. Blood supply, there's a lot of blood supply that's coming through. We've got arcuate arteries that are going to wrap around, basically go through the myometrium, and then we'll have radial arteries that'll branch off of those through the myometrium into the endometrium. Straight arteries are the basal layer, which are these right here, and then spiral. It was kind of hard to make them like that, but they kind of look like they kind of have that shape. We're going to move out into the functional layer. Moving outward, now we're starting to get into that sort of region between the internal and the external anatomy. We have the vagina, which is a elastic muscular tube, and we want it to be elastic, especially when childbirth comes in. And it goes from the cervix to the vestibule, which is basically that's the external anatomy. Okay, a vestibule is an opening to a building, kind of like a lobby or something like that. It's kind of a sort of internal external sort of thing. Men came up with all of these. Women could probably come up with a better description for that. I don't know. It has three main functions: the elimination of menstrual fluids, receiving sperm during intercourse, and it is the inferior portion of the birth canal. That lowest portion that females have to push the baby through during childbirth. Let's see, what do we got? So here's another diagram. Again, I'm going to keep sort of recycling the same diagrams because they're really useful. Okay, so we had the uterus with the three layers right in here. Here's the inside. The opening of the juncture in between. Okay, you know what? Back up. Scratch that. So we've got our cervix right here, which is the opening of the uterus leading to the vagina. Here is the vagina, that tube going to the vestibule, which is that outer, the external genitalia. That's the opening to the outside world. Because remember, the reproductive system is going to have organs and ducts that is going to be taking structures from inside of the body outside, and then in the case of females, outside in. The vagina lies parallel to the rectum in the back and the urethra in the front. Now in females, the urethra is much shorter, and we don't divide it up into the different sections like we do in the male anatomy. Again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to go make sure you take a look at that one. It's also separate from the reproductive openings. So in females, there are two different openings. We don't have that shared urogenital opening. With a lining the vagina, we have two sets of muscles called I'm going to try to write this out. The spongiosus muscles, and that's printed in the notes slides, so just copy it from there. Those extend on either side of the vaginal entrance, so they're going to be here and here, and the contractions of those muscles are going to restrict the opening of the vagina and cover something called the bulba vestibule. I've got some diagrams for that I'll show you where that is in just a second, which is a mass of erectile tissue, similar to what we find in the erectile tissue in men. And it has the same origins, embryonic origins, as the corpus spongiosum in the penis. And we've got a couple of diagrams, I think, in the third video that we'll look at, and we'll probably get into greater detail once we do the, sorry, that was a fireball, in the embryonic development in the tissue layers and stuff like that. Outside of that is another structure called the hymen, which is a partial blockage of the vagina caused by elastic epithelial tissue. And it's uncommon that this tissue is torn during routine examination, tampon use, intercourse, regular strenuous physical activity. In ye olden times, this was a sign of virginity, and a woman was more desirable as a wife if she was a virgin. And so prior to the wedding ceremony, officials would examine a woman's genitals to see if that hymen was intact. and it would cause a lot of problems, even though it didn't really break through any fault, I guess you could say, of the woman's actions or something like that. But we were, kind of backwards back in the day. So moving to the external genitalia. There we go. Okay. Okay, before we do that, still within the vagina. So it's you remember when we talked about the digestive system, and we said that parts of the digestive system, especially the large intestine, have bacteria that are mostly beneficial. We also find bacteria within that vaginal canal that are mostly harmless, actually to a certain extent beneficial. It's supported by nutrients created by the cervix. It creates an acidic environment, and it helps restrict the growth of many pathogens. And one of the things I mentioned in the male anatomy video is that there's a lot of structures within the female anatomy that can actually make things inhospitable for sperm. You can kind of think of it as a sort of evolutionary sort of thing. If the sperm can't hack it to make it all the way through, then you don't want that particular genetic makeup going to your offspring. That sort of thing. Let's see. If you're doing testing, it's called a vaginal smear, where they will actually remove cells from within the vagina that you can look at. They'll do it for cancer screening, determining stages of the ovarian and the uterine or the menstrual cycle. And if you have inflammation, itis, right? So vaginitis is inflammation of the vagina caused by fungus, bacteria, and parasites. So it's a disorder, basically. Moving to the external anatomy, then, we have the vulva, which is the entire area that contains all of the anatomy. Within that is a space called the vestibule that I had mentioned earlier in the clip. And it's bounded by skin folds. Those are the labia. There's two of them. There is labia minora, and then the labia majora, which is a bigger one that holds everything closed, basically. The urethra is actually going to open into the vestibule anterior, get a better one, to the vagina. So there's two separate openings again. Another look, so the bulb of the vestibule that I had mentioned earlier, here's this section right here, that's sort of just inside the labial folds. We also have glands within the external, accessory glands within the external anatomy, kind of similar to what some of the accessory glands in the male reproductive system does. They are going to provide lubrication, primarily, stuff like that. Other structures. Let's see, let me clear that away. So something that's similar, and it develops similarly embryonically, between males and females, is the clitoris. And the clitoris is actually two structures. Now, if you've watched the male anatomy video, you'll notice that we've got similar structures, okay? And they kind of behave very generally in a similar way. The prepuce, which is a fold of skin that covers the glands, yes, the same word that we use to describe the head of the male penis. And so, that's because it's derived by the same embryonic tissue. With that, let's see, I don't have it on here. Okay, I'll have to look at it. Okay, so the corpus cavernosum, which is an erectile tissue, develops in this area, and that's part of the glands. And then, let's see, the most exterior, we have the mons pubis, which is above the majority of the external structures. It's going to form the outer margins of the vulva. It helps protect the inner structures. It's very common to find hair in this region in females, and you'll also find it in males as well. And then this is one of the places when we talked about sweat glands way back in the day. We talked about the skin. We talked about sweat glands, right? Sebaceous glands, which are just sort of like the regular sweat glands, and apocrine sweat glands. This is one of the main places that you find those. That's the one that makes the stinky sweat, the more oily sweat, right? So those are going to be secreted into these areas. You would also find them in male external genitalia also. Let's see. So we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit. An important part of the female anatomy from a physiological perspective, also evolutionarily, is the breasts together. But the main reason why we're looking at them is for the mammary glands. There is a lot of really interesting reading as far as the evolution of these structures, and why is it that in humans they never go away, but in other primates they do. And so there's a lot of interesting discussion about the evolution of that in humans. But we're going to be focusing primarily on the mammary glands. They're specialized organs of the integumentary system, and they're primarily responsible for producing milk. And the process of producing milk is lactation. And it's also one of the things that sets mammals apart from other animals. Okay, we're the only ones that have glands and they're able to produce milk. The milk production process is controlled by hormones that are released during pregnancy and after birth. We have the actual nipple. That's where the milk comes out. And it has a collection of ducts that channel all of the milk, from the mammary glands into where the baby can get it. That was kind of awkward. That everything's all channeled. So these are the mammary glands. They get channeled into lactiferous ducts, then eventually into the nipple where it comes out. The areola is a dark, usually circular piece of tissue that surrounds the nipple. Each mammary gland is going to consist of lobes with several lobules, like mini lobes. So this whole thing is a lobe. Each one of these is a lobule, a secretory lobule. And then they're separated from each other by dense connective tissue. That's what this stuff is right here in the green. This sort of spiderweb network, and then you can see some in there also. The mammary glands will leave the milk will leave the lobules, and it will the lobules will leave the mammary glands and collect to the lactiferous ducts. And then from there, it goes into a larger chamber called the lactiferous sinus. So if you look here, there's the duct, and then the little bulge right there is the sinus, and then you get the final collection point at the nipple. There's 15 to 20 of these structures that collect at the nipple to collect all of that milk for the offspring. Here, so this is a couple of interesting diagrams. Mammary glands are only active in nursing women. If you're not nursing, then these glands are going to be inactive or resting. There's hormones that are released during pregnancy and then afterwards as the baby stimulates the mother's breasts. to produce milk. And then after a while, the hormone production starts to drop off. And that sort of coincides with when babies need to be weaned. Now, that doesn't always work out that way. It's an inexact science. I just remember thinking of, the stuff that we went through with my own children, and stuff like that. So, but for generally speaking, if you are actively nursing, you have activated mammary glands, and you can see the structural differences between the active and the inactive mammary glands. There's a number of ligaments that are known as suspensory ligaments that are bands of connective tissue that originate in the dermis of the skin here. No, you can't see that. Here. And then extend backwards. Areolar tissue with a type of connective tissue that basically extends to the pectoralis muscle that everything sits on. And then primarily the internal thoracic artery is what supplies blood to all of these tissues. That pretty much does it for the anatomy part. If you need to take a break because we've got still a lot of ground to cover, we're going to get into the physiology of the actual processes. So if you need to pause, this may be a good time to do that. Maybe come back to this in a little bit. I'll wait. Welcome back. We are going to talk about the physiology, the actual processes that are going on. And the first one we're going to talk about is oogenesis. Now, the formation of sperm is called spermatogenesis. The formation of oocytes is oogenesis. And we're going to start with an oogonium. So in males, it's a spermatogonium. In females, it's an oogonium. And we're going to go through the same processes. We're going to go through mitosis. We're going to go through meiosis. We're going to go through that final oogenesis step where we sort of formalize everything. Now, what's different that you'll see is the timing. There's a lot of points that this oogenesis process stops in women, and then it doesn't pick back up again for a number of years. This process actually begins in women at birth. It accelerates at puberty, and it ends around your 50s in a process known as menopause. During development, during embryonic and fetal development, the fetal ovaries contain oogonia. That's the plural of oogonia, so that they have these immature pre-egg cells, basically. They're going to undergo mitosis, so they're just doing cell division. We're going to see similarly that some of the cells, when they divide, are going to stay as oogonium and continue to divide, and some of them are going to turn into primary oocytes to go through this process. Okay. About this point, after about 5 months of development, females have approximately 7 million primary oocytes. The problem is we're not going to keep all of those. At birth, we're going to go down to about 2 million. So we've already lost 5 million. Most of them we're going to lose in a process that is known as atrasia. Which is basically it's degeneration of the egg cells. They break down and they get reabsorbed, basically. Those that do remain at this point will remain in prophase 1 until puberty. So they're basically going to be frozen until women get into their teens, right? At this point, by puberty, there's about 400,000 primary oocytes. Typically, around puberty, we're going to start having changes in hormone level. And we're going to see those also in men as well. And those changes in hormone levels are going to trigger the development of the continued
development of genitalia, secondary sexual characteristics, and stuff like that. We see it in both men and women. Let's see. So at this point, a primary oocyte is going to turn into a secondary oocyte. And during this process, we have an uneven dividing of no, I had it right the first time. An uneven dividing of the cells. In males, the cells divide more or less into 4 equally sized cells. In females, that's not the case. Your primary oocyte is going to turn into your secondary oocyte. Your secondary oocyte, that's what's released during ovulation, during meiosis 2. And that happens every month. The remaining cells, 2 to 3 cells, are going to turn into what are called polar bodies, which are basically just tiny, not used cells that will disintegrate and be reabsorbed, basically. Then after this point, the secondary oocyte, that the egg that we talk about that was released, is going to stay frozen in meiosis 2. Now, I keep using all of this terminology, mitosis, meiosis, and stuff like that. If you need a refresher on what's happening with mitosis and meiosis, you need to go back and study those. I'm not going to cover those right here. I've already got a ton of stuff I got to do. So go back. If you have any questions, we can talk about it. We can do a quick review in an office hours or something like that, okay? Meiosis 2 doesn't complete, and we get all of the final divisions and cleaning up until after fertilization takes place. If fertilization doesn't take place, then the egg stays frozen in meiosis 2, and then it eventually is removed from the body. That's the menstrual cycle, or the uterine cycle, which we'll talk about later. So, the overall process of oogenesis. The primary oocytes that are made up until birth are frozen until puberty. Rising follicle-stimulating hormone. I'm going to go ahead and write that down. If this is your first video, FSH is follicle-stimulating hormone, not mome. I don't even know what that is. Okay. And so when females are going through puberty, FSH levels are going to rise. That's going to trigger the start of the ovarian cycle. Okay. So this is the actual releasing of the eggs part. Okay. Nope. Where did my stuff go? After puberty, each month roughly thereafter, some of the primary oocytes are stimulated by these hormones to develop into secondary oocytes and are released. It's not one of those things, like in males, we make a whole bunch, and then if you get rid of those, you just make a whole bunch more. In women, it's more or less one at a time. Each month, one of them is stimulated, and then another one in the line behind it starts to grow, and then the next month, that one is going to be released, and so on and so forth. Okay, so here is an ovary, and that's going to show us the different stages, I guess, of the ovarian cycle. And so we have these structures called... mine didn't... Okay, sorry about that. So here is our ovary, and it's showing the cells in the different stages, okay? And so we're going to start with these structures called ovarian follicles, and they're going to be located towards the cortex of the ovary. Now, we used cortex a bunch in especially the urinary unit with the kidneys, right? So when we're talking about the cortex of something, we also talked about it when we talked about the brain. That's the outside, okay? So that is the most superficial internal part of the organ. So within the cortex or the outside of the ovaries, we have ovarian follicles, and those are specialized structures that where oocyte growth in meiosis 1 is going to occur. All right, so we start out with our primary oocytes that we saw on that diagram a couple of minutes ago, right? They're located near the tunica albuginea. Let me write that down. Tunica albuginea, and that's simply this outer layer right here. Okay, that membrane that sort of binds everything together. They're in clusters called egg nests. And then there's a single layer of follicular cells, which are just smaller cells that surround them. So from there, we're gonna take our primary oocytes and we're going to turn them into ovarian follicles. And so they start out basically, they are primordial ovarian follicles. And so these cells are going to enlarge and divide and form several layers of cells around the primary oocyte, which is going to create something called a zona pellucida. So here's our primary oocyte. You can see the formation of those follicle cells. Eventually, we're going to have a complete ring of those follicle cells around the oocyte with the zona pellucida as sort of the division between the two. That structure with those cells and the oocyte in the middle, that's your primary follicle. Okay. Okay. So from there, our ovarian follicle is going to continue to grow and turn into a secondary ovarian follicle. The granulosa cells, those follicular cells that started out as one layer, they're going to continue to grow, and we're going to get a deeper layer around the secondary ovarian follicle. This wall around the follicle is going to continue to thicken, forming a tertiary ovarian follicle, and we're going to start seeing fluid coming in and filling up this space between the inner layers and the outer layers. So here's our outer layers here, here's our inner layer, here's that fluid-filled space called the antrum. For the next 2 to 3 months during development, the wall is going to continue to grow and get deeper. We're going to get more follicular fluid in there. The follicle itself has doubled in size from the secondary follicle to become that tertiary follicle. From there, we'll complete the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle, it's a monthly process of maturation that we kind of just looked at. Ovulation, which is release of the oocyte, and degeneration of the tertiary ovarian follicle, the stuff around that cell. And it's divided into 2 phases. The first phase is the follicular phase, which we kind of looked at there, and then the luteal phase, which is sort of the ending phase, I suppose you could call it. So what we just described was the events leading up to the follicular phase. So the actual ovulation is the release of the secondary oocyte. And what's going to end up happening is the tertiary follicle is going to create a bulge, kind of like that. Okay. The oocyte and its immediate cells around it are going to project into this antrum and be surrounded by these granulosa cells. We're going to see, and I've got a graph that I'll show you later, rising luteinizing hormone levels. Will force the oocyte to complete meiosis 1 and get partway through meiosis 2. At that point, the ovule is going to start to become expelled from the ovary, creating what's known as a corona radiata, which is this sort of sphere around the oocyte. And that's simply the cells, those granulosa cells, these ones, that are still associated with the cell. And so you can see in the diagram here those cells that are still around the oocyte as the oocyte is expelled. And that, as it's being pushed out, is ovulation. The oocyte is going to be released into the pelvic cavity. It's going to travel down the uterine tube and make its way to its resting place, I suppose. Whatever follicles that started but did not complete are going to disintegrate through atrasia and be reabsorbed, basically. So once that takes place, that's the follicular phase, and we'll get into the luteal phase with the formation of the corpus luteum. The remaining granulosa cells that were left behind are going to form a tissue layer. Now, this tissue layer is yellow because there's a lot of cholesterol in there. And that cholesterol, in the event of fertilization taking place, is going to convert into progesterone. That's going to prepare the uterus for pregnancy and the changes that are about to take place. The formation of this happens approximately 12 days after ovulation takes place. Then we'll have the formation of something called the corpus albicans, which is produced by non-functional corpus luteum as fibroblasts, which are cell types that are going to start coming in and converting it into scar tissue. The formation of this tissue marks the end of the ovarian cycle. Here is, I've got another diagram that just sort of highlights that whole process, starting with the primordial ovarian follicles. If you downloaded this as a PowerPoint or you want to screenshot this from the PDF and drop it in your notes, I think that's helpful. Okay. So that was the ovarian cycle. That's one of the very important cycles that happens within females. The other one is the uterine, or the more commonly referred to as the menstrual cycle, which is the repeating series of changes to the endometrium. Remember, we said the endometrium, a lot of stuff happens to it, and this is when it's going to start happening to it. It lasts anywhere from 21 to 35 days, averaging on the neighborhood of 28 days. The first time a female starts this cycle, that first cycle is known as menarche, and it begins at puberty, typically around 11 to 12. Okay. The end of all of this, so fast forward several decades to menopause. That's the termination. The cycles are over. That coincides with that number of eggs, oocytes, that females are born with. This typically happens between the ages of 45 and 85. It can happen earlier, it can happen later. These are just averages. The uterine cycle has 3 phases. The first phase is the menstrual cycle, the menstrual phase, then the proliferation phase, and then finally the secretory phase. The menstrual and the proliferative phases occur at the same time as the ovarian follicular phase. So they're running at the same time. And then the secretory phase happens during the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. Clear as mud, right? Perfect. Okay, so we have the menstrual phase first. And so we have degeneration of the endometrium, that inner layer of the uterus, which occurs in patches, and it leads to menstruation. And so this is where the this is where the menstruation is actually happening, with the degradation of this endometrium and the shedding of this tissue. What we're doing is those spiral arteries that kind of look like that are going to constrict, restricting blood flow to all those tissues. The arterial walls are going to rupture, releasing blood. That's where bleeding comes from. As those layers are being shed. Menses themselves is blood and other materials that are discharged from the uterus, and if the functional layer of the endometrium is completely shed and it gets rebuilt out of the uterus, through the cervix, through the vagina, all the way out. The only thing that's left is the basal layer that's supplied by a different set of arteries that don't break down or change or anything like that. It can last 1 to 7 days. 30 to 50 mils of blood are lost. There's a condition known as dysmenorrhea, which is painful menstruation, and there's several causes to it. It could be pathogenic, it could be hormonal, structural, that sort of thing. Okay, so menstrual phase has gone through. Remember, at the same time this is happening within the uterus, those follicles are developing and getting ready to be released by the ovaries. We're going into the proliferative phase. That's the second phase. And so basically what we're doing is we're rebuilding that functional layer. Epithelial cells that are secreted by endocrine glands are going to surface and spread out. And we've got revascularization. Those spiral vessels are going to start making their way back in, allowing blood to flow back into those tissues. This is happening about the same time as the tertiary follicles in the ovarian cycle are forming. And we basically, it's at this stage that we completely rebuild that functional layer. I forgot my train of thought. That's fine. Then from there we have the secretory phase. The uterine glands within that functional layer of the endometrium are going to increase their rate of secretion. We're going to have increased vascularization. The ovulation is going to begin here, and the formation of the corpus luteum. The secretion of cells peaks at about 12 days after ovulation. This is preparing the uterus for the impending pregnancy. And this process stops once the corpus luteum stops producing hormones, and it's going to do that if the egg is not fertilized. Then we start over again, back with the menstrual phase, where that functional layer that we just built up starts to break back down and then gets shed. This whole process and the reproductive cycle is governed by hormones, primarily from the pituitary feedback between the pituitary gland and the gonads. And so there's a very complex pattern of checks and feedbacks and stuff that are between that coordinate the ovarian and the uterine or the menstrual cycles. Certain steps within the ovarian cycle are going to trigger release of hormones, which are going to trigger structural changes in the uterus, so on and so forth. Here's a graph and some diagrams sort of showing how these hormonal changes coincide with structural changes to both the ovaries, the follicles, and the uterus. Early at the beginning of the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, so we're here in this section, okay. Estrogen levels are low. So if we look down here at the bottom, estrogen is the red, and those levels are pretty low. The gonadotropic stimulating hormone, the GnRH, are also pretty low. That's the green right here. And so the pulses, because we said those are releasing pulses, 60 to 90 minutes. That means each day you've got anywhere from 16 to 24 pulses. Relatively low. Concentrations are relatively low. As the tertiary follicle starts to form, so here we are in the middle right here. So as this tertiary follicle starts to form and get bigger, as we're following along, right about here, where that tertiary follicle really forms, we have an increase in those estrogen levels, okay? We're also going to see a corresponding increase in the number of pulses in GnRH. And so now we're going to do a pulse every 30 to 60 minutes. And so here's that green right around there, you see. We're going to see an increase in that gonadotropic stimulating hormone. That's going to stimulate the luteinizing hormone secretion. It's going to increase, and we're going to see that spike right starting to happen about there. Around day 10, so that puts us about here, and you can see that spike is going to is happening about here. Around day 14, so just after that, we're going to switch. We're going to have that massive increase of LH peak right around there, being released from your pituitary gland. That's going to trigger meiosis of the primary oocyte, the rupture of the follicular wall, and the actual ovulation to take place. So if you notice right here, right around day 14, we're going to have that surge of luteinizing hormone that's going to cause the oocyte to leave the ovary and travel into the fallopian tube. 34 to 36 hours after that surge happens, ovulation takes place. So if you notice, the actual ovulation happens at day 14. Right before that, you see that surge to trigger that. And then once that occurs, an ovulation takes place, your luteinizing hormone levels drop significantly. You also see a spike in the follicular stimulating hormone, right? So this is where we're getting to those follicles. You see that jump in the FSH, that's going to stimulate this follicular development right there. That's going to that peak is going to happen about the same time as the luteinizing hormone. Also, high levels, if you look, are going to promote the production of progesterone, which is going to trigger the formation of the corpus luteum. That's going to happen here. You're also going to have a decreasing of the pulse frequency of the GnRH hormone, which is going to rapidly change the secretion of the luteinizing hormone. And as long as you have without the luteinizing hormone is going to maintain the structure and the secretions of the corpus luteum. After that, progesterone levels are going to stay high. If they don't continue to stay high because fertilization took place and now we have pregnancy, those the progesterone levels are going to start to drop, and estrogen levels are going to start to drop. And so here's we've got estrogen, which kind of spiked, and now it's coming down, and progesterone is also coming down. And that's going to cause the degradation of the corpus luteum. And actually, that's how the more common birth control pills work, is by adjusting the progesterone and the estrogen levels. Now, different birth control pills address different hormones. Some of them are progesterone only, some of them are estrogen only, some of them are both. But basically what the pills are doing is they're tricking the body into thinking it's pregnant. And that basically stops this process, or at least regulates it, depending on what you're taking. there's certain hormonal birth control methods that basically, as long as the hormones are being released, you don't ever go through this ovulation phase. Sometimes it's more of the monthly cycle. It changes hormone levels. Then basically the process starts over again, and the GnRH pulse frequencies will begin to increase after dropping off through that luteal phase, which is going to stimulate the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. That's going to start the ovarian follicle development. It's also going to stimulate the luteinizing hormone production, and then we've started our cycle over again. Estrogens are really important. I'm going to kind of pause. This is sort of non sequitur, I suppose. Talking about... there we go. Estrogens. Estrogens are really, really important hormones in females. They have 5 primary functions. They stimulate bone and muscle growth. They maintain secondary sex characteristics, distributions of body hair and adipose tissue, for example. They can affect central nervous system activity. Estrogens are one of the primary drivers for sex drive in females, just like testosterone does the same thing in men. It maintains the function of the accessory glands and organs that we mentioned at the very beginning, and it initiates repair and growth of the endometrium. If you don't have these estrogen levels, you don't have the repair and the growth of the endometrium, and you don't start these processes over again. Here's another look at the different cycles, and this is looking primarily at the changes in the endometrium during these different phases. So progesterone levels and estrogen levels are going to decrease, which is going to cause the corpus luteum to degenerate. That's going to lead to menstruation, where we're destroying this endometrial tissue and getting rid of it, shedding it out, okay? Then estrogen levels are going to start to increase again. That's going to get us into this phase, and we start to repair this functional zone, right? So as the estrogen is increasing, we're repairing that functional zone. This is going to continue until progesterone starts to increase, which is going to trigger the release of the ovary and the actual ovulation, and the formation of the corpus luteum into the secretory phase of the menstrual cycle. The uterine glands in here, as you notice, are going to start to enlarge and get bigger and make more cells onto that surface. Also the activity is going to increase of the cells. They're going to secrete more. Also, something that's interesting is these different hormonal changes will also change a female's average body temperature. During the luteal phase, which is this section right in here, body temperature actually is going to go up. Not just a little bit, like a degree or so, but it does increase a little. During ovulation, the basal body temperature, your sort of average temperature, drops just a little bit, so that's right there. And then there you see that you have that sharp spike, and it remains high. And then once you go through that luteal phase and you go into that menstrual phase, body temperature drops way back down. Like I said, these aren't drastic changes in body temperature, but it's kind of interesting that you have these sorts of changes. Let's see. Well, shoot. Actually, I think that's it, right? What's the big deal? That was super easy. So here's a diagram explaining the feedback system of the hormones within the ovarian and the uterine cycles. Okay, I'm not going to run through all of this stuff. However, I will say go through this. Okay, but basically, we're going to release the gonadotropic stimulating hormone. Okay. That's going to trigger the release of the follicle stimulating hormone. Now, the arrows are the stimulation, inhibition or the cutting back. That's the blue. Okay, so that's going to we're going to produce and secrete FSH. That's going to lead to the development of ovarian follicles. It's going to secrete estrogen. It's also going to secrete inhibin. Now, I didn't mention that all that much in this one. And inhibin is going to do something very similar to what it does in males. So in females, inhibin secretion is going to increase as we're increasing follicular stimulating hormone, and then we're going to reach a certain threshold where we stop producing FSH and LH, and then the inhibin concentrations are going to start to drop off, and then we're going to keep going through all of this over again. This is also going to start changing secretion of LH. Now, it's interesting. Estrogen starts off limiting LH secretion, but then it switches after right before ovulation. That switches, and so estrogen actually is going to stimulate the production of LH, and that's where we see that spike and the ovulation taking place. The secretion of estrogen is going to do a lot of that stuff that we saw down here at the bottom. Progesterone is going to be mostly tied with luteinizing hormone during the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So take some time to look at this. I would recommend diagramming out your own version of this cycle. Because it's a really important feedback cycle in humans. That's it. If you haven't done the male anatomy, please go and do that right now. If you've done both of them, you're in the home stretch. All we want to do is what happens to our reproductive system as we get older, fertilization, sexual function, stuff like that. And then we'll be good. If you have any questions, send me an email, send me a remind, find me on office hours. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the time in whatever day you have, and I will talk to y'all later.